Welcome to the new podcast show, The Truth with Dr. Ruth. Join us in the chat room as she shares her personal stories and thought-provoking discussions on various topics. Feel free to explore these podcasts and join the engaging conversations. Invite a friend to our discussion that goes beyond conventional narratives, fostering a community where truth and understanding prevail on the podcast show, The Truth with Dr. Ruth. See you there.
The Great Slave Uprising of 1816 in Barbados. In the late 17th century, artisan plantation in the parish of St. Philip covered a large portion of the parish, which was owned by the Franklin family. It included land which today has the range of names Artisan, Pollard's Mill, Vineyard, Gaskin Land, and Padmore. In the early 1700s, the plantation became subdivided as a result of marriages, and the name Franklin's Plantation became focused on what is today known as Vineyard. What is now Artisan Plantation known as Sheaf's after John Sheaf, 1729 to 1802, a Franklin relation by marriage. John Sheaf married Walker Belgrave, a St. Philip resident some 16 years his junior, in 762, who bore him 2 sons and 3 daughters. In 1784, his eldest daughter Dorothy, born in 1767, married Joseph Bailey Franklin 1756 to 1803. The owner of the neighboring plantation which had kept the name Franklin's. And in 1793 his youngest daughter Mary Ann married Arthur Ortison, a Scottish merchant from Bridgetown. This union produced 3 children: Arthur Jr., Clementine, and Mary. John Sheaf died in 1801, and in his will stated that the plantation should be inherited by his grandson Arthur Jr., but he was only 5 years, so the plantation was held in trust until the age of 23, and until then it was to be held in trust by his son-in-law, Arthur Ortison Sr., and a lawyer, Matthew Colthurst, a former Attorney General in Barbados. The death of John Sheaf and Joseph Bailey Franklin within less than a year of each other left the 2 sisters, one a widow, living on the 2 neighboring plantations. With the loss of the stabilizing influence of 2 older men, family tensions began to increase. The main reason was that 2 years before his marriage to Dorothy Sheaf in 1784, Joseph Bailey Franklin had fathered a son by one of his mulatto slave women named Leah. He acknowledged the boy as his own, and his mother named him Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin. He and his mother remained slaves, the property of his father. An obvious favorite of his father, one can only imagine the emotional undercurrents in the household as Dorothy's children by Joseph Bailey Franklin were growing up. With the 2 plantations very near, Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin and his half-sisters, brothers and cousins would have met fairly frequently. When Joseph Bailey Franklin died, however, he manumitted Leah and her son, and as well leaving the property, and to his son, he provided that he be taught reading and arithmetic and then apprenticed for 5 years to any trade of his choice. With the heads of the 2 families newly deceased, the Ortisons and the Franklins united to contest the terms of Joseph Bailey Franklin's will, particularly in relation to the money and property left for Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin. Now, in those days, even though he was a free, it was forbidden for a man of color to enter a courtroom to give evidence. So, we all know how that story went. So with them being unable to represent themselves, the court found against them. This unjust outcome turned a bitterness in Joseph Pitt Franklin's heart, and it set him on a path for justice and for emancipation of the slaves in Barbados. Now let me state here, and this is my own opinion, when people in Barbados speak about the uprising in Barbados, we only speak about Bussa and have a statue with him, but what happened to Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin? Was his name too long to mention? Or was it because he was half-caste, or what they called mulatto? In 1807, England's Parliament abolished the slave trade in its colonial empire, making slave trading a felony equal to piracy. There was a growing movement for the abolition of slavery, with the voices of William Wilberforce and other abolitionists in England Parliament. This cause led the slaves to believe that it was their emancipation that was being obstructed and withheld, and thus this started the groundwork of the slaves' uprising in Barbados. Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin formed an alliance with a man named Bussa, an African-born slave who worked as a ranger, a senior and trusted position on the neighboring plantation of Bailey's. Buss was clearly an intelligent man and a leader, and gradually he and Franklin formed plans for an island-wide slave uprising to form a new government in Barbados with Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin at its head. 2 other free men of color were involved in the uprising, Cain Davis and John Sargent. However, their roles were clearly less as important as they were the offsprings of poor white fathers, whereas Franklin was the son of a planter and was better educated. Franklin was literate and articulate man, and was clearly the catalyst, in that he would have reported the newspaper articles, and interpreted political opinion, and social views prevailing among the white ruling classes to Bussa and his colleagues. Franklin would also have been closely involved in the formation of strategy and tactics. Obviously, they did not take into consideration that England had a full regiment of the fighting troops at the garrison Savannah in Bridgetown, and a small detachment at the militia post and signal station at what is now the neighboring landmark of District C Police Station. Plus, Barbados do not have anywhere to hide, no mountains and no tropical forest as those of the other islands. The slaves had believed that they had been freed by the British government and that the planters were withholding their freedom. They also thought that the British troops at the garrison would side with them against the local militia and planters. They were very wrong, as they misunderstood what was said in England. The plan for the uprising was that a signal would be given on the night of Easter Sunday, April 14, 1816, by the firing of certain cane fields in St. Philip. Under Franklin and Bussa, the revolt spread rapidly throughout the parish and then into neighboring Christchurch, St. George, and St. John. But there was a betrayal in the air. However, the uprising failed to spread to the rest of the island as planned. Cane fields on approximately 40 estates were put to the torch, and plantation houses and buildings were pillaged and burned. Franklin Plantation and Ortison were among the first to fall, although it's significant that no whites were killed or injured. The ground floor of Ortison's house was destroyed, and considerable damage to the extent of over £1,400 was inflicted on the estate. The slaves' army overran the local militia post and captured some muskets, but the euphoria was not to last. The following day martial law was declared in Barbados, and within less than 2 days the uprising was crushed by the Bridgetown troops. Scores of insurgents, including Bussa himself, were killed in the fighting, and many of those taken and were court-martialed and executed on the plantations. Later, some 123 others were shipped under heavy guard to Honduras. Martial law lasted for nearly 6 months. More than 400 slaves lost their lives. Joseph Pitt Washing Franklin was imprisoned and was tried and convicted on June 29 for both inciting and aiding the slave rebellion. The General Court-Martial assembled in Bridgetown on the trial of Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin, a free man of color, having sentenced and adjudged that he should be hanged by the neck until he had passed, and at such time and place as the Commandant direct. The execution was conducted on the militia parade ground at Enmore, Lower Collymore Rock, opposite the site now occupied by the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Bridgetown. Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin was 34 years old. Again, why do not we hear anything about Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin when we in Barbados speak about the uprising in Barbados? We only acknowledge Bussa. Why can we not have a statue of Joseph Pitt Washington Franklin at one of the roundabouts in Barbados also? I thought that these are very fair questions. I am asking, is it because he is mixed? But I've always heard if you are not white you are black, and if you're not black you are white, and he was definitely a black man and should have been recognized. The people of Barbados have the right to know this fact, and it is a true fact. Thank you for listening, and remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Therefore, you would not miss new content. This is the last historical story for the year, but I will be back in January with more exciting historical stories of this little island Barbados. And whose truth? No other than Dr. Ruth.